premonition dreams, dreams where something happens in the dream and then the exact same thing or something very close to it happens in life. How does science explain that? Believe it or not, science does try, although many scientists veer away from this topic. There are some who don't, namely Julia Mossbridge, who is a neuroscientist who studies dreams and premonitions and what she calls precognition. So partially the way that scientists who research premonitions explain it is through what they call causal loops. And this is the idea that the future reaches back into the past, gives information to you, and then you use that information to change the future. And so an example of that is you wake up in the morning and you're supposed to take the subway or the train to work, and you get a really strong feeling, or you had a dream the night before that it was dangerous to take the subway, and so you don't, and then later there's an accident. That can be explained by causal loops, sometimes scientists say. The problem with causal loops, as I said yesterday, is that they contradict the second law of thermodynamics, because that law points out that if the future can change the past, then the future can also override the past, which means that the future will never happen, which means the causal loop doesn't exist. So in other words, if your birth can be affected by a future event and then overridden, then you won't be born at all. And so that's a paradox that makes the idea of causal loops seem impossible. But scientists lately and recently have explained this with two theories. One is called the many futures theory, and the other is called the near miss theory. The many futures theory is, as it sounds, the idea that there are many versions of the future and that in each moment we make decisions which then create that future, and the other possibilities remain in parallel next to us. And then the near miss option is similar to what I explained about causal loops. It's the idea that events from the future can affect our movements in the present and then shift certain events from being what they could have been to what they become because of our awareness of their possibility. So you wake up and you're aware that there could be an accident on the subway, so you walk, and it turns out that there was a little bit of a derailment, but nothing happened to anybody. But if you had gone on the subway, perhaps there would have been an accident and you might have had a tragic outcome. So that's the near miss theory. Why do I mention all of these things? Well, what if when we have these experiences where we have premonition dreams, which, like I said, Julia Mossbridge researches, what if there is a way to become aware of these premonitions and use them in the present to either help ourselves or help others? And I'll give you an example of how that could be. My father and my sister have both passed. My father from a disease called frontal temporal dementia, which Bruce Willis has, and my sister from cancer. And before my sister was diagnosed, I had a dream one night, I think it was in like 2014, that she and my father were in a car that my father was driving. And he started speeding up, and my mother and I were watching from a distance. And as he sped up, he approached a brick wall. And just before he crashed, and I woke up from the fear of that crash, I heard my mother's voice say, "He's going to lose that license." And when I woke up, I was so depressed. I had such intensity of feeling about this dream. And it lasted for about a week. And I found out later that a few days after I had that dream, my father lost his license because of something that happened in a public place, and he couldn't have his license anymore because of his disease. And so my question is, and my reason for sharing that is, if I had spoken my experience of that dream to my mother, would my words have shifted something? That's not to say that my father shouldn't have lost his license. He probably should have. But would it have shifted something, for instance, with my sister, who was in the car with him, remember, and who was diagnosed with cancer not long after that, and who recently passed from cancer? So if I had spoken it, I'm not suggesting that my words would have changed anything dramatically, but perhaps they would have changed something because of the energy of the words and the awareness of the future. And so, interestingly, when Mossbridge does research on dreams, she has learned in her research that people who experience premonition dreams often will have them in a repetitive fashion, and that repetition will increase the closer they get to the actual event. And so she takes note of their dreams and has seen a pattern in her subjects that, as for instance, the incident of my father losing his license, if I had had repetitive dreams about it, then they would have picked up and paced closer to the event. And so I posit that not only does the repetition increase, but perhaps separately, the intensity of the dream is stronger the closer it is to the event. And so my experience was not to have repetition of the dream, but to have intensity of the dream, an intense physical and emotional reaction to it. And so I share all of this because people often ask, how can I use my premonitions in life? How can I become aware of them and organize them and understand them? And the first thing to do is to write down these dreams that have either repetition or intense emotion, and start to note how those emotions feel, so that in the future, when you have these kinds of dreams or intuitive knowledge, you recognize the difference between a regular dream that is just images and words and sounds and stories from the dreams that have actual effect on the future. Same thing with your intuitive knowledge. Start to note how it feels in your body and how your emotions respond to it, so that you can see the difference between just regular thoughts and intuitive thoughts. And so that's a good way to organize it. And this is all to say that science is working toward trying to understand these things that are, in fact, very real.